This is an oral history interview. One of the things I was reading, he gave us a link to like a Smithsonian thing giving you advice, and they said like the first thing you should do is establish who you're talking to, where and when, so that if somebody's looking at it in 100 years or whatever, they have the context of when you've done the interview. So, my name is Campbell Smith. I'm for a project for my journalism class. I'm interviewing my dad, Mike Smith, in his home, our home, on December 8th, 2025, at
7:30.
7:30ish. Yeah, 7:33, 7:29.
We're in Slidell, Louisiana.
We're in Slidell, Louisiana,
Which
and
is near New Orleans.
and I have prepared a list of kind of prompting questions. I mean, we covered a lot of stuff in the class about journalism history, and obviously because of you're covering journalism history, you're covering major events, especially in America, and obviously you're older, lived through a lot of that stuff, and I know for a fact you have input on some of it because you taught me history in high school. So I figured I would ask you
Trying to
about.
stay awake. Go ahead.
Sorry,
I'm
our
sorry.
dog is in surgery
Recovering
today.
from surgery.
He's
Go
a little
ahead. I'm
sleepy.
sorry. I'm sorry.
His my first question for you: when were you born and where?
I was born in Baptist Hospital in Memphis, Tennessee, in December the 9th, 1958. So I'm about to be 67 tomorrow.
Okay. What were some of your earliest memories?
I have family memories of a vacation we took in the Smoky Mountains, and I remember my dad feeding the bears, I think, which was a terrible idea, and also in a pool in Florida. But I mean, the first memory that I really have of the outside world as it related to me would be John Kennedy's, not the assassination itself, but I do remember the Oswald, the suspect. They were walking him up out into the police garage, and I remember him being gunned down live on TV. Because I watched the news, my family. I watched whatever was on TV. I was a TV kid, and I always watched the news. I was always interested in the news and what was going on around me. So I was a little unusual. I didn't realize it at the time, but I was a little unusual in that I followed national and world news, where most kids my age had no idea what was going on. I'm not saying I did that because I was an intellectual in any way. It just was what I was interested in. But I remember Kennedy's funeral, and I remember the John saluting the casket when it went by, because they preempted. They had it on Saturday because it was supposed to be. They wanted the widest possible audience they could have, so they preempted my favorite Saturday morning show, which is Bozo the Clown, and I raised holy hell about it. My mom beat my butt pretty good because she was a big follower. She really liked Kennedy, so those are my earliest memories.
Yeah, I remember you telling me Grandma was pretty politically, at least somewhat politically inclined.
She was very politically inclined. My dad a little bit less, but they both were active. And my dad tended to be a little bit more conservative. My mom tended to be a little bit more liberal.
But Papa was politically at least outstanding because I know you told me his dad was very different from him politically.
I'm not really sure what his dad politically. I'm sure he was very conservative, but I also am sure that in the time period that they grew up, which would have been the 20s, actually the 1920s and the 30s. By the time he got through the Depression, just about everybody in the South was Democratic. My grandfather and grandmother had a picture of FDR on their wall, and it was like up there like a picture of a saint. And so they were Yellow Dog Democrats, and my mom was also Yellow Dog Democrat, and I'm assuming my dad pretty much was, although later he started voting more Republican. He would swing his vote. And Tennessee, every now and then you'd have somebody that would get elected as Republican. And so when the South started to change and become a little bit more Republican, and Republicans made inroads into the South, my dad was one of those people, and I actually voted for some Republicans early on for governor, and senator when I could vote. But the Republican Party was much different than it is today. It was more middle of the road and more of a country club set, and it wasn't as populist. There's a lot of things that are different about it today than it was back then.
I got some other questions that, I mean, I guess these aren't really in like chronological order, but I wanted to ask you, because we did a lot of coverage about how journalism changed during the coverage of Vietnam, and I wanted to ask you if you remember a lot of the discourse about Vietnam. Did it impact your life in any way? Like, do you remember seeing protests, watching news footage about it?
Sure, I remember the press was unrestricted in Vietnam because you can only put censorship. Wartime powers emergency wartime powers allow you to censor the press.
Yeah, we talked about that a lot in class. The various like stages of censorship through World War One and how it was different during World War Two.
So Vietnam was different because Johnson didn't want to go get a declaration of war. He thought that would be hard to get, and so he just basically got a forced resolution. He never actually went and got a declaration of war. That turned out to be a big mistake for him. He never built up a popular support or had a coherent goal and plan. It kept changing, because of the war, because the war was continuing longer than they thought it was going to. And so they thought they could get in and get out real fast, and they didn't declare war. And because of that, he couldn't censor the press. So the press, for the first time, was able to file uncensored reports, and they actually were able to move about freely and get themselves embedded in the units. And so you actually saw, for the first time, you could see it by satellite almost immediately, but even taped reports you would see within a couple of days, and you really saw more of what war was really like.
How did you feel about it as all this stuff was coming out of Vietnam? We were watching the footage and stuff. How did people in Memphis feel about it in that time period?
Memphis was very conservative, and the South tends to be very, at one time, they're very pro-military. Lots of Southerners serve in the military.
We got a lot of military bases down here too.
Yeah, so they didn't have as much of an anti-war movement in the South, although as time went by, that picked up, and you have more anti-war movement in the late '60s, early '70s. The turning point kind of came really under Johnson because the war, there was a idea that the war was not going that well, or it was a stalemate. We didn't seem to be making a lot of progress, and Johnson put on a full all stops out PR campaign to convince the country that the war was being won and we had a light at the end of the tunnel. And then
do you remember any of the stuff that he put out during that campaign?
Sure. I mean, he was on TV. He had people on TV as administrators, just like they do today. They went out to the press and they did press junkets, and they had.
At the time, did you feel like he was being truthful? Did you feel like it was working?
Well, let me finish. And there was a belief in the United States for a long time that basically whoever was president would tell you would be relatively truthful to you. And that ended with Johnson and Nixon. Okay, those two really kind of started this idea that all politicians lie to you, including the president, and you can't trust anything they say, and you can't trust the government in any way. Now, there were some specific reasons for that, but Johnson pushed this narrative out there, and then after about 4 or 5 weeks, all hell broke loose in Vietnam because they had been planning a major offensive all across the country. So it made Johnson either look like he didn't know what he was talking about, or he was a liar deliberately, or both. And it killed him politically. I remember shortly afterwards, he announced that he wasn't going to run for president again because he'd lost. He had narrowly won in New Hampshire, and it looked like he was going to lose going through the primaries. So he decided to try and end the war. He opened up truce negotiations. That went nowhere, but he did try. But during the Tet Offensive, which is what happened, the Tet Offensive, you had the My Lai massacre by American troops.
Yeah, I was going to ask you if you remember the coverage about that breaking.
Yeah, that came out about a year and a half later because of press coverage, basically, and because some of the men in the units were relentless in not letting it die. And so that tainted our role in Vietnam. You know, it's really hard. But the other thing was you had this every day for like a month. They're fighting to regain control of Vietnam. And at one point, early in the struggle, they had a police commander in Saigon who executed a guy. It was a sapper, a guerrilla activist, and he executed the guy with a pistol, just like a summary execution. Okay, and that really shocked people. And I remember eating spaghetti for dinner, and I look up, and this guy's getting his brains blown out on TV at 5:30 in the afternoon. Today, I don't know that would be shocking, but it was very shocking back then.
Was there any push to? I mean, you literally could not air that today. They would not let you put that on the TV because of advertisers and stuff like that.
I don't know about that. I mean, I've seen some pretty graphic stuff with the various wars, especially with civilian deaths and things like that. But I've seen some pretty graphic stuff.
Was there any
there.
concern?
And there's stuff
about...
on YouTube. You can look up all this stuff on YouTube. Like Saddam getting hanged. Somebody snuck a phone in and recorded it, and it's on YouTube. You can see him getting hanged. And I don't know that they would have shown that. I don't know that the regular press outlets would have shown that. I think they would have maybe shown him going in and then maybe the body coming out or something. I don't know that they would have shown him getting his neck stretched, which is exactly what happened. So I think in some ways, there's a lot more graphic stuff out there than there ever has been before.
Well, was there any concern at the time as a lot of this graphic stuff was being aired about you guys having access? I mean, there's conversation now about kids being exposed to violent video games too early,
Right.
about seeing, PG-13 movies before they're too old to, or,
Right.
meanwhile you can literally turn the news on, or you used to be able to turn the news on and you can watch a guy get his brains blown out. Was there a conversation at all about, like, maybe we shouldn't be letting people watch this, or shouldn't be letting people see this, or we should be censoring it?
Well, there was a lot of criticism. Movies were also headed towards more graphic violence. They were moving away from the old Hays Code standards, so they were liberalizing like sex scenes. There were a lot of more nudity, sex scenes, more graphic violence. We played Cowboys and Indians. We played World War II. We had we went and saw war movies. I mean, I don't think that warps. I don't think the video games warp people either. I think if it's in a vacuum where most people grow up knowing imaginary versus reality. Okay, and they're able to differentiate between that. Like I played Grand Theft Auto when it came out, and I knew you can't run around and like in Grand Theft Auto. We all knew that. I think most kids are able to make that differentiation, and I think also the context and culture that they live in is important too. If the culture and the parents emphasize certain values, usually they absorb those values, and I'm not really that worried about it. I don't think that it might desensitize. It might make people less sensitive to things that are going on around them. But I just don't think that that's what's causing the problems, or I don't think censorship would particularly eliminate the problems you're trying to solve in that regard.
Do you remember any of Cronkite's broadcasts?
Sure, I remember Cronkite coming on air and saying he didn't think the war could be won at the present time. He said it was a stalemate, and he just didn't see how it could be won, unless something changed dramatically. And Cronkite was enough of an influencer. He was like an original news influencer. More people watched his news than all the other news programs combined. And he had high ethical standards, and he took his job as a journalist to be neutral very, very seriously. People understood that, and he held a lot of opinion. You don't have any one person in news or journalism that functions like Cronkite did. And so when he turned against the war, Johnson was watching the news show, and he turned to his aide and he said, "I just lost Middle America." And that was somewhat true.
Do you remember when news broke? How did it make you feel when you remember hearing about the My Lai massacre?
I read that in the newspaper. I didn't see the video footage until later. We were pretty shocked. I was older by then. All this came out a few years after Tet. And a lot of this I read about when they put one of the lieutenants in charge, the main lieutenant in charge of one of the platoons. They put him up on charges. They court-martialed him and they brought him up on murder charges. And he was convicted. I felt like he should be convicted from everything that I read and saw. And they did convict him, but then Nixon pardoned him shortly afterwards. He didn't spend too much time in jail, which is a real travesty to my way of thinking. I mean, it was a complete unit breakdown, but he did nothing to stop it. He encouraged it. So to me, it was a war crime.
Did it change the way you felt about, how did you feel about Vietnam at that point? Or
I was already against the war. I thought that what we were trying to do, which was ostensibly to bring democracy, was kind of a farce because the South Vietnamese government, I knew it was very corrupt and wasn't popularly supported. But I thought that what we were doing there was involving ourselves in a civil war. And the second thing was we were unleashing so much firepower on them that we were just as bad in a way for them and destructive and murderous as the Viet Cong were and as the NVA was. And so I just didn't think we needed to be there. There were places in the Cold War that we got involved I didn't think we needed to be in, and Vietnam was one of them. Now, Vietnam wound down and they ended the draft before I was draft age, but I was starting to think ahead when I was like 12 and 13 years old, going, man, I may get drafted or selected for this, and I don't know if I want to go.
did you and Uncle Stacy know anybody who got drafted?
My cousin was draft age, and I didn't know. I knew a lot of people after the war, veterans. I met them and knew them on a personal basis. I did not know anybody that went, but I do remember when they had the selection, they would have it like a lottery. It was a lottery system, and the ping pong balls, they had ping pong balls for January 1 all the way through December 31st, so 365 ping pong balls, and they would draw them up. Okay, and if you got one of the first 100 or 120 numbers, you were going. And so my cousin had watch parties, and they got all drunk and watched them pull the ping pong balls up. And some of them were crying at the end of the night and very upset. Some of them were deliriously happy and drinking pretty hard. Both of them were drinking pretty hard. And I thought it was kind of a strange thing to watch your fate pop up on a TV screen, literally. He never got called up. He always had a high number, like 300, 320. So he would have been the only one that in our family that was of age to go. I missed it by about 3 or 4 years.
Do you remember like the news breaking about Watergate?
Yeah, I followed Watergate pretty closely. At first, nobody really knew what to make of it. It was kind of a minor news story, somebody breaking into the Democratic Party. And then as more and more came out in it, it ended up, in the end, the last year, we were in a just tremendous constitutional crisis. We weren't able to get things done because it was basically the president trying to stay in no matter what over everybody else. I was a big Nixon supporter when I was younger. Now I'm older now, and I've done, studied a lot on Nixon. And Nixon was not fit for the. He just wasn't psychologically
What attracted
fit for the
you
job.
to
Wait a
Nixon
minute,
at the
let me
time?
finish. Let me finish. So he wasn't psychologically fit for the office. So I believed Nixon because I was young, right up to the very end. And then when it came out about the tapes, and on the tapes, he definitely was guilty. You can tell. I was stunned. I was really stunned. And his presidency and Johnson's really left a mark on how people felt about the government and the presidency in general, including me. Okay, now I'm finished.
Sorry, I didn't mean to. I just
It's
was
okay.
trying to get like a. Do you remember when King died?
I was in third grade and maybe second grade, 68. So I probably would have been in, I believe it was in third grade. Okay, yeah, I was
Third or
in third
fourth.
grade in an elementary school. It was all white. The only black people there were janitors. We knew King had been in town. He came in for the garbage strike. The march the original march he led did not go well. He planned another one. He was assassinated before that happened. They sent us home from school. They didn't have school because there were riots after he was assassinated. It's not on the same scale as some cities, but there were riots, and they burned some of the black areas of town. Burned some of their areas, and one of them was pretty close to where we lived. So they brought in the National Guard, and we were under martial law, and the Guard was there for a while. And so every day I walked home from school, and they had a tank right on the convenience store near my grandmother's, and the tank was there. The National Guard tank was there, and we used to march by it and all that because we were little kids. And one day, the guys decided to have a little fun with us, and they cranked up the turret and leveled the gun at us like they were going to fire. And that scared the hell out of us, so we took off running. And my grandmother went down there and gave them a piece of her mind. My mother got busted for running the curfew one night by a blockade. The Guard had a blockade set up. But she was very good looking and charming when she wanted to be. And so she flirted with the lieutenant, and the lieutenant let us through.
Why were you guys out past curfew? Do you remember?
I don't remember. I remember having a discussion with my dad about why they were there. Why they were there for the garbage strike before he was assassinated. And my dad was like, "Well, they want everything," and I'm like, "I think they just want to vote." I think they just want to vote. And he's like, "Yeah, I understand that." My dad I was very lucky that neither of my parents, my mother was definitely not racist, and my dad really wasn't either. And the way that he was raised out in the country by his all his sisters were. So he wasn't for some reason. He just never was really racist. He always looked at people as people. I was very lucky in that regard to have parents like that.
Did Papa take an interest in that kind of stuff at all?
Yeah, there was a lot of you couldn't really ignore it. It was on TV all the time. There were marches and everywhere you had civil rights marches going on. You had Vietnam War marches going on. You had marches for women's rights. I mean, it was a time when people would voice their opinion, and they were willing to go on the street to do it.
Do you remember anything about? I mean, I know that your high school wound up being integrated, right?
My high school integrated by because of the economics. It wasn't a forced integration, but and we had a low student body, and they were thinking about closing the school down. So actually, they ended up busing white and black kids in to keep that level up. But we were about 60-40. So we didn't have a lot of the problems. We had been 60-40 for a while, 60% white, 40% black. And we didn't have a lot of the problems that the other schools did with the busing, with the kids coming in and being angry and all that. Although there wasn't, whites and blacks tended to keep to their own camps. There were people that crossed over and had friends. I had some black friends and they had some white friends, but we didn't hang out a lot together. It was kind of different camps. Now the athletes kind of hung out together a little bit, and I was kind of in the cool group, cool smart group, and we hung out blacks and whites. Okay, but we didn't hang out. We kind of were. We had our group of friends, and we kind of stuck with our group of friends.
Do you remember the first time you had a class with a black kid?
I didn't have a class with a black student until I was in fifth grade, and I was in a lab school on Memphis State University's, now University of Memphis State University's campus, and I had a black student in there, and he actually was from Africa. He had a South African, a Kenyan accent. I think he's from Kenya, and that was I take that back. I went to fourth grade school in a county school, not a city school, and there were a lot of black kids in that school, but they weren't usually in my grade. They weren't in my. They had us on different tracks, and so they weren't in my track. I was like the top track, and they just didn't have any of the black kids in there. But now when I went to the other school, I had a black kid in there, but he was from Africa. So I didn't have a large number of black kids, what you would say is an average student, until I got into seventh grade, and I moved into the school that I eventually finished high school in. And at the junior high level, that mix was about 50-50. And it was kind of a cultural shock because these kids are from the ghetto. And I wasn't from the ghetto. I was kind of poor working class. But it was very much a cultural adjustment for me. I had some adjustments that I had to make. And, sometimes it was rough.
Were there a lot of black students at LSU when you got here?
I went to Memphis State for a couple of years, and Memphis State was like 60-40, 70-30, white-black, and we were all used to going to school with each other, and I was used to having them in classes and being around each other and all that, no problem. When I went to LSU, I transferred, and I didn't really notice. I was there for a few months, and then I noticed I was out in the middle of the quadrangle talking to people in between classes. We used to meet there, and all of a sudden I realized, I'm like, there are very few black people at this school. I'm looking around, I don't see any black people. And I asked my friend, I wasn't from there, I'm like, and the ones that you did see tended to be either like super, super smart, or they were athletes, almost always athletes, when you did see one. Okay, and I don't remember having that many of them in my classes in the 4 years that I was there. And I asked this friend of mine, he's like, well, they're all at Southern, because it's cheaper. And that they opened Southern up there so they didn't have to integrate. They put money into Southern so they didn't have to integrate. And I'd say that was true. Now, today, that's no longer true. There's lots and lots of African Americans.
Yeah, I think I read something that it's close to 50-50 now.
Oh, okay. Well, I didn't know that.
I don't know if that's exactly true. It's actually causing Southern to suffer a little bit.
Oh my goodness. Okay. Well, I think that's good.
Do you remember? Were there any major events on campus by the time you got here that you remember of interest?
I got there in 1980. The campus was very conservative in general. The social structure. It was heavily Greek oriented, although there were a lot of people that were independents. It tended to be they backed Reagan. It was real preppy. There was some alternative counterculture stuff, a little bit, not a whole lot, which I kind of sampled that a little bit. And then I straddled both sides of the fence. I guess the funniest thing was somebody got in before the Tulane game. We figured it had to be a Tulane student. They got into the tiger cage and they released the tiger. Now, nobody knows who did that to this day. That was in 82 or 83. Okay, they had to get in the cage with the tiger in order to release the safety valve or the bar to let the tiger out. And the tiger, which is insane, the tiger walked around campus for 3 or 4 hours, and then round about daylight, security cops were making their rounds, probably eating donuts, drinking coffee, and bullshitting, and all of a sudden there's a tiger walking around. They had to call the Baton Rouge Zoo to come down with a tranquilizer gun and take the tiger out. And they herded the. They were worried they couldn't get it done before classes started, because there was no campus-wide system of cancellation back then. So they herded it into one classroom. They kind of moved him into a classroom, and then they came in with the trank and the dart and shot him and put him down, and then put him back in the cage. And then they rebuilt the cage where you couldn't possibly let him out.
Was there any like demonstrations or protests or anything on campus you can remember? About anything?
You had Free Speech Alley. I thought Free Speech Alley was. They're still running it. It allowed people to blow off steam. They have political rallies. I was a leader of the Young Democrats, the president of the Young Democrats down there. So we have political rallies for Evelyn Edwards, a governor candidate, gubernatorial candidate, and several other people. So you had stuff like that. You had one women's meeting, protest in general. But by then, that kind of Vietnam was done. A lot of the civil rights stuff was done initially, anyway. Women's rights, all that. So you didn't have those things that were irritating people or getting people upset. The anti-abortion movement was pretty small back then, and so they weren't real active. It wasn't a time of protest like on the campuses in the 60s and early 70s.
Do you remember anything else about the Edward Edwards era that you feel like you should talk about or comment on?
Well, I worked for Edwards. I worked for his campaign. I was an advance man, and he had quite the reputation. And he was running against Dave Treen, a Republican. He was the first Republican governor since Reconstruction, one-termer. When Edwards beat him pretty soundly. And so I was a advance man, which was a fancy term for somebody who would go out and make sure all the arrangements were made, or drive people if they needed to be driven, or all kinds of, do whatever needed to be done. Very low level. Very unimportant in the grand scheme of things. But I did drive Edwards once. His regular driver wasn't available, and he went to Augie's Glass Gardens, which is a restaurant famous restaurant in Metairie, and a lot of yachts went there, and a lot of mafia guys went there, a lot of crime guys went there, and so we went in. He was going to meet with somebody to get it to talk to him about the campaign, probably to get a donation. Every time he did that, he got a donation. And we went in, and these two guys stood up, and they were in these Italian suits, and they looked like they were straight out of casting for The Godfather. And I looked at the governor, and I said, "Well, Governor, I'm going to wait for you. Where are you sitting, Governor?" And he goes, "We're gonna sit over there." I'm like, "Okay. Well, I'm going to be way over here waiting on you." And he goes, he did. I didn't want to hear what they talked about. I didn't see any money exchanged, but I'm sure promises were made. The governor had a reputation for sleeping with women. He hit on, he tried to pick up a date I had at a party. Now, he knew me. We weren't buddies or anything, but he knew me. And I had a girl there, and he hit on her, and she turned him down, and he just went right on down the line. No problem. He went to the next one. Okay, it was just about making the sale for him. It wasn't about being particularly attracted to people. He just wanted to see how far he could get and how far he could sell himself. Okay, and part of me was like, what a jerk. And then the other part of me is like, wow, I wish I had that confidence that I could do that, in front of other people. But he kept a bearskin rug in his office, and I was in a meeting. I couldn't figure out why I was in the meeting. And the place was full of people, and they were talking about campaign strategy and stuff. And I was daydreaming because they weren't going to ask me anything. And I was looking at the bearskin rug, and I'm like, I've seen this thing a million times. I can't understand why he's got it in here. Edwards was a big hunter. Like he killed just about a little bit, one of everything in his life. And I'm like, I don't know why he didn't keep this at home. And then I'm like, oh, he's got it in here from when he's got one of his girlfriends in here. And he did. They called him the Silver Zipper. And I said, why do they call him the Silver Zipper? And they're like, because he's fast. He works fast. And I'm like, okay. So he had girls that he'd slept with and women he'd slept with stashed in every one of his campaign headquarters. He gave them a job. And they were like his spy network. Like they would report back to him. So whenever I went over to deliver stuff remotely, I'd drive to the campaign headquarters, and somebody there, usually a woman, would say, what do you think about the governor? And I would go, I like him. He's great. I love working for the governor, because I knew they were reporting back to him. Now, at some point, they sent me over to his house in Baton Rouge to give him a message about something that Treen was doing. And I knocked on the door in the middle of the afternoon. And I assumed there was a campaign aide there, and I was going to give the news to him. The governor answered the door in his tidy whities and said, "What do you need?" He goes, "They sent me over with this news about Governor Treen." He goes, "Let me tell you something. Anything Governor Treen does is not worth waking me up from my nap. And you tell him that. Don't have him send you back out here on some goose chase like this again." I'm like, I got it, Governor. And I went back to the thing. He had a real interesting sense of humor. He had a fundraiser. He had all the people from Washington, John Breaux, the senator, Huey Long's son, Gillis Long, one of the Longs, Russell Long, all these movers and shakers. And he was late, which he usually liked to be the last dignitary there, And I got a call. They paged me to come get a call. And I picked up the phone. The governor goes, "Is everybody there?" I'm like, "Yes, Governor, everybody's here." And he goes, "What are they all wearing? Tell me what Bennett Johnson's wearing. Tell me what Russell Long's wearing. Tell me what so-and-so's wearing." Well, they're all wearing power suits and ties, okay? So the governor showed up about 10 minutes later, the only person in the room in cowboy boots, a cowboy hat, and a bolo, okay, because he was going to be remembered. He wanted all eyes on him. He had that flair and ability to do that. So the worst part of the campaign, I guess, his brother was shot. He was a lawyer. He was killed by an irate client, and they sent me out to find the son. The guy's son was in law school at LSU. I knew him slightly, and so I thought I was going to have to break the news to this guy. They sent me out to find him. They sent 6 people out. This was before cell phones. So I went to the guy's apartment, and I was shaken because I did not want to have to tell him his dad was dead. And I got very lucky. Somebody beat me by 5 minutes and pulled him out of there. And that's it for Edwards.
Edwards, do you think it was interesting that, Edwards was presenting himself as a Democratic candidate, and this was during the Reagan resurgence?
But the South was still heavily Democratic. It was moving towards the Republican Party, but it was still heavily Democratic. Now, so he had a solid base. He had a solid base of black voters that voted for him, and he had quite a few whites that voted for him. And he was enormously popular while he was governor. He actually got quite a bit done in his first 3 terms. Now his last term, not so much. That more was a function. I don't think he would have gotten elected if David Duke hadn't been in the campaign as a Republican candidate. Okay, I didn't work for him at that point.
Do you think that Edwards, did it disillusion you at all to be around? Edwards was mover and a shaker, and obviously a smart guy, but he was a politician. Like, and you talked about realizing that when the news about Nixon broke, like, these guys are all liars. Did you get frustrated with like the political machine? Did you just come to accept that this is part of it?
Um, I was older, I was still I wasn't, when Nixon resigned, I was like 13. So I had less illusions about adults, I guess, in the adult world by the time I was in my 20s when I worked for Edwards. And I had already worked for another politician, the Secretary of State, Jim Brown. And I participated in politics. And I kind of understood more about politics. I didn't consider Edwards to be a liar. And it was kind of taken for granted that he slept around. I didn't think anything about that one way or the other, because his wife certainly knew he was doing it, and it made her peace with it. Yeah, but I didn't think that he was a hypocrite, and I thought that he actually got a lot of things done. So there was a certain amount of corruption. Okay, people understood that. They knew what he was. In some ways, I'm not comparing him to Trump, because he was very, very different character-wise than Trump is. Okay, but people liked him and voted for him, warts and all, understanding that. And he was a very colorful and charismatic politician. He could easily charm you into voting for him.
Do you remember anything about, obviously growing up and then coming to campus, anything about the attitudes of like gay people on campus? Was it different from Memphis State or different from Memphis? I worked in the restaurant business in Memphis, part-time and full-time. And so there were a lot of gays in the business. So there were gay people in my high school. I didn't have a lot of contact with them. But when I got out of high school, I had a lot of contact with them because of working around the restaurant with them. And to me, I didn't have a problem with them being gay. It didn't threaten me in any way. I knew that I wasn't gay. I knew that for sure. And I didn't see them to be a threat. And and their relationships, from what I could tell, worked the same way that hetero relationships work. They had the same fights about the same things. They bonded over the same things, basically. So I didn't see them as a threat. Did some people see them as a threat?
Sure.
Like a threat to the fabric of society, a threat
Yeah, somewhat. And there was a lot of contempt in the male, at least for men, because they were effeminate. And I think some of that was fear. I think some of that was based on fear and misunderstanding, not understanding who they were or what they were. I don't notice that there was a lot of outward hate directed or prejudice directed at them, but I'm sure they felt that a lot of people disapproved of them and didn't like their lifestyle and didn't support them in any way. They felt that. They knew that.
What about here on campus?
You in campus too, and I don't think you very rarely heard anything about gay women. It was all mostly gay guys. Okay, now towards the end of it, in the 80s, you started picking up, you started getting AIDS. Okay, and initially with AIDS, now this is after I was out of school, but for a lot of the hetero straight community, there was this kind of belief that, well, gays are kind of getting what they deserve. They shouldn't be engaging in these sexual acts, and if they weren't gay, they wouldn't be getting this disease. That was before it spread to the heterosexual community in a larger way. Okay.
Do you remember any news about the upstairs lounge fire? Did that make enough?
That happened before, and I didn't hear about that until much, much later. I read about that. so I didn't hear anything.
I was just
about
curious, wondering if it made national news or anything.
that. It was national news. I just don't remember it. It wasn't on my radar. Okay, the Stonewall riots really weren't on my radar either. I didn't see that. Now they did have gay rights parades, but I don't remember too many of those in the South. The South, like I said, tends to be a little bit more conservative.
I remember you told me that after you graduated, you were working for a paper up in Dyersburg.
I graduated from college, and I was supposed to go to law school, and I decided not to. And I took a job with a paper, and took a job with the Tennessean up in Nashville, and I reported on a little bit of everything. It was a small town. Dyersburg's like 10,000 people. The county was probably 50,000 or less. And so I got to report on everything I did. And I had no real training. I had been a history major, so I was used to writing academically. And journalism is much different. You got to be able to crank stuff out. You have to condense it down. You have to be able to hook people. You got to find where your lead is. You got to develop your leads. I had to learn all that, on the fly. And I have to say, I did a pretty good job. It took me about a year maybe to piece it all together, but I got pretty good at it. And I found it very, very interesting. And newspapers still had a pretty wide circulation back then. Although to put it in perspective, the whole time I was there, I published all kinds of different stories, political, social, cultural, sports. I did op-ed pieces. I did a humor column. I was the only reporter they had, basically, besides the editor who owned the paper. And I got some feedback from people, but I went on a couple public affairs shows. The Saturday afternoon ghetto, they used to call it, when nobody was watching because everybody was watching sports or doing something else. They weren't watching public affairs shows. But I did a couple of public affairs shows where we were questioning. It was kind of like the Sunday shows, only it was local and it was questioning.
Was it on the radio or on TV?
It was TV. Okay, more people reacted to that, to me, in the week or two that followed than had ever said anything in the 2 or 3 years that I was writing. And so it just shows you the difference in power for television and video over the written word as far as news goes. I still think that's true. I mean, the written word allows you to go a lot more in depth. The video or television or film world is hot. It's emotional. And people are attracted to the emotional and not necessarily to the print. Print's harder. It's harder for people to digest it. They're going to want to do it, and a lot of times they just don't want to do it.
Was it hard to get people to talk to you?
I found most of the time I could get people to talk to me. They had an agenda usually, and they wanted to get that agenda out. And so they generally would talk to me. I didn't have a whole lot of problem with that. I had some good sources. I developed some good sources. And I usually, if I knew I was going to have problems with somebody, I would go in with a lot of research on them or the subject, and I would have a lot of questions that I knew I would answer that would almost force them to talk about it, or they were going to look really bad. So people want to get their share of the story out. Very few people are willing to just snub the press, at least back in that time period.
Do you feel like journalism has changed a lot? From when you were a kid to when you were kind of involved in it to now?
Sure. I mean, the power of the newspaper is dwindling away. Although I think the online newspapers kind of represent an ability to maybe make a comeback. I mean, they're positioning themselves now to say we're not. We research our facts. Don't go on Facebook, or don't go on the internet, or go on the internet. And when you hear these things and you're not really sure if they're valid, come to us and we fact check them. So I think maybe there's a place for traditional print style journalism done in electronic form. But yeah, it's definitely changed a lot. I mean, the traditional powers of the media, the television to some degree, the print definitely has diminished a lot. And I don't think that's necessarily for the better. I think people are, it's very easy for people to find something they want online that already, validates the opinion that they already had before they actually started studying the problem, whatever it is they wanted to look at, whatever they wanted to know about something. So I think that's a lot worse. But it's possible now. You've got podcasts. You've got so many different ways to get your information, which means there's different ways for people to provide that information. The problem is there's just so many lies and false sites out there. And once that's out in public, it's very, very hard to take it out. It just gets repeated over and over and over again. I think that's worse. And I think that people have learned how to use media. They've always used media to spread propaganda for whatever it is that they want. But now what they're doing is they're spreading their propaganda, but they're also invalidating fact-based information. Okay, to call that into question, they're saying it's fake journalism or fake news. And I think that's really harmful to the country and the world.
I know that you left LA before the Rodney King riots broke out. Do you remember anything about the public attitudes of the city at the time that is interesting to think about or talk about? Do you remember how you felt after you saw the coverage of it?
Yeah, I moved out there to take a job from Memphis for FedEx, and I was our delivery area was Watts Compton, so I delivered to a lot of people of color, brown and black. And they had the hearings on. I could hear them during the day. The retired people, older people and whatnot were watching the hearings. And I remember a couple of them telling me that things are going to get bad if this doesn't go right and these guys get off. We're going to have problems. And I'm like, I didn't believe it because I couldn't believe it. I'm like, there's no way that these cops are getting off. I mean, they got video. I watched the video. These guys were way out of line. They were criminal in their activities towards this guy. There's no way they're getting off. And, because I'm in LA, I'm in Los Angeles.
It's different than
there was a racial divide in Los Angeles, definitely racial divide in Los Angeles. It's not as pronounced as the South, but it was there, these old black people looked at me and said, "Son, you're not from here, right?" And I'm like, "No." Because you don't understand Los Angeles. These cops could walk. And sure enough, I went on vacation back to Memphis, and the Rodney King verdict came out, and the riots, not the initial riots, but the next round that started in Compton at Florence, at the corner of Florence and Florence and Normandy, maybe, I don't remember. It was a liquor store, like a 7-Eleven convenience store, liquor store. I delivered there. I knew that place. And I knew a lot of those places that showed up on camera. And some of them got burned, and a lot of them were black owned, which I thought was a real travesty. Mostly what they did when they rioted was they burned their own neighborhoods. I understand why they were angry, but it's counterproductive. I thought it was counterproductive. And I didn't get home. I didn't come home. I took my vacation. They had to shut the station down. They shut several stations down.
The FedEx station?
The FedEx station. Our station did not get burned, and it didn't get broken into only because they backed tractor trailer trucks up and blocked every exit, and they had security guards inside and threatened to shoot anybody that came over the trucks. But when I came back, I was shocked at the amount of damage, particularly in Koreatown. They really burned Koreatown out pretty good. And I've got all kinds of interesting stories that I heard about the riots. My roommate, I called him up, and he was a big surfer, and he worked in the desert at the Skunk Works. He helped make the first stealth bomber. He's an engineer. There were 5 of us split the house because that's how you do it. It's the only way you can afford to live there. So he would get up in the morning. He would drive to Ventura, which was the other way west, and surf. And then he would drive like 50 miles into work. So he had to get up like god awful early in the morning. But he was a dedicated surfer. And I'm like, well, what's going on over there? And he goes, well, not much. The town's out of power. A lot of the town's out of power. And the guards here, and the federal troops and the guards here, and we're just watching parts of the city burn because we lived in the hills. He said, I'm on the rooftop. And we're all getting stoned, and we're just watching the city burn. And I'm like, okay. And he goes, but the good thing is, there is a good thing. I'm like, well, what's that, Walt? And he goes, I could get to Ventura in like 10 minutes because there weren't any cops.
It's like with COVID, there's no traffic.
Well, there wasn't any traffic, but more importantly, all the cops were busy. He knew
So they
that.
couldn't get pulled over.
He couldn't get pulled over, so he was going like 100 miles an hour, to get in the water, and then he'd drive to work, And I'm like, well, as long as you got your priorities straight, But when I got back, they sent me out right away. Like, there were only 2 or 3 white guys that worked in the station, and because they promoted from within the city, and I've transferred in. So there were like 3 white people, and I'm like, well, they probably won't make me go out and do that much because it's pretty dangerous. I think it might be pretty dangerous out there. They sent me out with like 100 stops, okay, and so I tried to deliver to 3 or 4 places, and they were all either burned down or closed. And so I just went to the back of the van, and about every 5 minutes I'd hit the tracker, the computer tracker, and say, closed, 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 closed. And I just spent 4 or 5 hours in my truck and drove back because I wasn't going to drive around because the guard was out, but they weren't everywhere. And it turned out that the guard didn't have ammunition, which I thought was kind of stupid. They didn't want people getting shot accidentally. I do understand that. But
they deployed him with no ammo?
Yeah.
That's crazy.
I think
not even like handgun ammo?
I think under Trump, they're deploying with ammo. Okay, but back then they usually would deploy them without ammo. And they had a shooting during one of the Vietnam protests at Kent State because that guard unit was issued ammo by mistake.
That's the one that Neil
State.
Young wrote that song about.
Yeah, Kent State, right. They weren't supposed to have ammo, but they did. Anyway, so they had a lot of places burned out, like, and I talked to people who were cops and rioters and stuff like that, and they all had really interesting stories about it. But that probably would be for another day, I guess.
You can get into any of it if you want to. We got time.
Okay, well, one cop, I'm talking to him, and he's like, well, he said, it turned out the night of the riots that the city police chief was at a fundraiser and wouldn't stop his fundraiser to go respond. And the mayor had not directly, they were having a feud, they had not directly talked to each other in like a year. And so there was really no contingency planning done for if things went bad and there was a riot, no contingency plan. And they hadn't called up extra police. Okay, so they were literally caught with their pants down. So they told this guy to show up at the rendezvous point where they were all rendezvousing at one of the armories or something. And they sent him out alone, to go out and police some area of Koreatown, I think. And he said, I said, well, what'd you do? He said, so what could I do? He said, everybody was looting and burning and destroying stuff. Who do I pick out? And if I pick out, does the mob turn on me? And so I just sat there and watched it. He said, finally, 5 guys showed up rolling a grand piano down the middle of the street. And I went over to the guys and said, what are you guys doing? Do any of you actually play the piano? And they're like, well, no. And I'm like, and do you live anywhere near here? And they're like, no. And I'm like, so isn't this kind of stupid? And they're like, you're right. Let's go loot the liquor store, which is what they did. So in Koreatown, they had a apartment complex, and the apartment complex was mostly Hispanics. And I was talking to a friend of mine that was Hispanic, and he goes, yeah, a lot of the Hispanics, more of the Hispanics are involved in the riot than blacks, because they were upset about the verdict, but they saw the first couple of nights that, the riots were going on in mostly black areas, and they knew the cops would be there, and so they started looting because they knew the cops were busy in other areas. And so it spread to a lot of the Hispanic areas. And so this apartment, they went to the Korean shop owner. He owned a furniture store, and he said they were taking the stuff down. This is like a month later. They were taking the reports down. And they asked him, he said, well, what happened? He says, well, they broke in and took all the furniture. He said, well, you got any idea where any of it is? And he goes, yeah, the apartments across the street over there. They all got some of my furniture. I'm like, how do you know that? I said, because right after the riot, they put all the old furniture out for the garbage guys to get. And so the cops are like, okay. So they went over there, and sure enough, these guys had stolen all the furniture. Well, the jails were full, and the courts were full. And so they didn't arrest these guys, but what they did was they confiscated the entire apartment's furniture. They got all this furniture and gave it back to the Korean guy. So now they don't have any furniture. Like their old furniture got picked up, okay, and the new furniture they stole they took back. I thought that was pretty ironic. Okay, I delivered in the Wano area, the downtown, the homeless area, and when I came back, they were all wearing like these nice suits. Okay, well, that's the garment district where they are, and they have these custom-made suits there that they'll make for you, or they'll make a prototype for you, and then you take the prototype to a factory and you get the stuff made in the factory, cheaper. Okay, it wasn't necessarily for retail sales; it was wholesale showcases. It was just showcase shops. Well, they broke in. It was the jewelry district and the garment district. They broke in, and so these old moms are in like these $800 Italian suits, no vent suits, double-breasted suits. And I'm like, Willie, you're looking good. And he goes, I am, aren't I? And I'm like, yes, you are. And he's like, yeah, I'm drinking high on the hog too because we broke into the jewelry district. And so I'm not drinking cheap wine, I'm drinking scotch. And I'm like, way to go. And he goes, you want to buy a ring? And I'm like, no thanks. But it must have been driving the shop owners crazy because the garment guys, the guys that own the shop, they could see the bums walking up and down the street in their suits. And it was driving them crazy. And the cops wouldn't arrest them because they're vagrants. I mean, they're not going to do anything to them anyway. If anything, they put them in jail for a few days and put them out on the streets. And nobody wants to suit after those guys have been wearing them, so.
It's just kind of a waste of resources.
Kind of a waste of resources, yeah. So there are all kinds of stories like that, all kinds of stories like that.
So was it kind of a culture shock moving out to LA?
It was it was different. It definitely was different from where I was. It was a lot more culturally liberal and more upfront, especially with gays and lesbians. LA's a big city. It's a huge metropolitan area. So you want to go to a Samoan area, they got a Samoan area. You want to go to an Ethiopian restaurant, they got an Ethiopian restaurant. That took a little getting used to. I had not lived in a city that big. I had lived in some million-plus cities, but not 5 million. And
it's way bigger now.
Yeah. So I was used to going out and seeing people I knew everywhere I went. You never got that in Los Angeles. I was single. You never got that in Los Angeles. You rarely ran into anybody you knew. You would have to take people with you, if you wanted to go with people out, or you would have to be very extroverted.
You couldn't just
meet people while
I'll go to the bar because I know somebody will be there. I can hang out with.
Yeah,
them,
that didn't happen unless you were a regular at a bar, or like a regular at like a neighborhood bar. And LA's a working town. Very few people actually work. A lot of people work in show business, but that's just one part of the economy. And so everybody else has jobs. They live their life just like everybody else does. The city didn't have like a central area. It did, but it was kind of artificially built to be a center of the city. So what happened is it spread so fast that you ended up with taking in all these little towns and cities, and so you have these little satellite cities everywhere. And so there really isn't like a center area for LA. There's kind of a cultural heart that would probably be Hollywood or the movie areas where the movies are made and the people live. But you could live in your own little area and never venture out of it. You could work there, you could shop there, you could eat there, you could.
It's kind of like living by campus.
Yeah, in a way.
Campus is kind of a bubble now.
Houston kind of reminds me of that. There's little bubbles everywhere. And the disparity in the city, like we served USC, which is a rich person's campus mostly, in the middle of this real ocean of poor people.
Kind of like LSU.
Well, not. It's worse. It was worse out there, a lot worse than LSU, or a lot poorer. And it was a very different culture in the ghettos. And you could drive like 10 or 15 miles away and be in Beverly Hills, which was very, very upscale, exclusive, and all that. I lived in Beverly Hills for a while, but so all of these neighborhoods, there's a lot of disparity within the city. There's a lot of just everything in there. And it was a different way to live. The weather was very different. I like that. It was dry, didn't get cold much, didn't rain much. I had to get used to riding through earthquakes, Santa Ana winds, mudslides. Traffic was awful, and I was in the business of delivering packages, so I had to adjust around the traffic. Gang activity was much greater there than it was back home. And so there were a lot of gangs there, and you did have to be very careful because I was working in an area where the gangs were very active.
Leaving LA, do you remember anything major happening when you moved back to like Memphis, when you came back to Tennessee?
Well, I moved from LA up to Monterey near Carmel and on the bay. And that was a very different area to live in too. It's a very upscale area. It's a lot smaller. The town was a lot smaller. It's very tourist oriented. It was very beautiful. I ended up transferring from there to New Orleans. I never went back to Memphis. I transferred to New Orleans, and I had known, I had lived down here when I went to school. I didn't live in New Orleans. I was Baton Rouge, but my dad had a business in New Orleans, and I moved to be in New Orleans to help him, to be in the New Orleans area to help him, and eventually I moved to Slidell first, and then I moved back. I moved into New Orleans, and I ended up meeting my future wife, I ended up establishing a relationship with my future wife that led to my marriage and your birth. So I'd have to say that's the town I'm the most favorite. My most favorite one.
New Orleans.
Yeah, at all of them. I like Monterey a lot too, though.
Do you remember 9/11?
Yeah, I was getting ready to go to school, and in the morning, and my wife was working. She worked at home, and I was getting ready to go teach high school history, and I'm eating breakfast and in and out and kind of watching the news, and I remember going in to tell my wife, I think a plane hit the Trade Center. Now, planes had hit the Trade Center before. I knew that. Okay, and
like an accidental.
Yeah, and I assume that's probably what it was. And I could see smoke rising, and nobody really knew the extent of the damage. And it was early on in the reports. There wasn't a lot of information out there, just pictures, And then I'm coming in and out, and I happened to be going through the living room when I saw the second plane come in and hit the tower, and I knew then it was a terrorist attack. I knew it was a terrorist attack. I assumed it was probably something that Iraq did, that Saddam had done. a lot of people felt that way. But when that second one hit, you know, I knew right away that I thought the buildings were going to come down. It looked to me like one of them was knocked off its foundation, was leaning, and I remember telling Natalie, I hope they. So, oh my God, another plane hit. It's an attack. We're under attack, and they better get all those people out of there if they can, because those buildings are going to come down. Okay, and then I went to school, and everybody knew about it pretty soon. And so I did, you know, they were trying to tell us, have class, you know, try and have a normal day. I'm like, it's not a normal day, and this is history, and these kids need to be involved in it. You know, they're high school kids, they need to know what happened, and they need to remember it. So I ran the TV all day. And there were all kinds of rumors floating around. Like, I assumed that they'd shut the airspace down. I'm surprised they didn't do it any earlier, but then the word came the Pentagon got attacked, and the other plane went down in the field. So we knew it was something really bad, you know, and there were all kinds of rumors. And then, because at the end of the day, they lost power in some areas of New York, and they shut down all the transit systems. People had to walk home.
Yeah, I remember reading about that.
Yeah, so some of them walked for miles, like to go into Jersey, you know, to go home or up past the city and all that. And there were all kinds of rumors floating around, you know, about what happened, and it was a real shock. It was, you know, I didn't experience Pearl Harbor, but I would imagine, excuse me, I would imagine it was kind of the same vibe. And then there was a tremendous amount of anger and unity for some sort of vengeance and payback, you know, which I was certainly in that crowd.
What did you feel like the fallout was going to be from that?
Oh, I thought we were going to have to go to war, which we did. You know, and the weird thing was, like, after they started talking about Al Qaeda and Osama bin Laden, I remembered from, I was at a friend's house. Your mom and I were spending New Year's Eve at a friend's house in rural Louisiana, and they had kind of this roundup of news at the end of the year, like these oddball stories that didn't get any press. And one of the stories was Al Qaeda declared war on the U.S. They declared that there was a war they were having a war with the U.S. And I'm like, Al Qaeda, I've never heard of that. You know, it's a terrorist group. They mentioned Osama bin Laden, and I'm like, right, like that.
Yeah, 15 guys in a cave.
Yeah, 15
war,
guys.
Whatever.
Whoop-de-doo, you know. And I forgot all about it. Until they started bringing in, like, hey, it's Al Qaeda and this guy's Osama bin Laden. I'm like, Natalie, that's the guy that they had the news story on, the crazy crackpot, you know. So it's kind of weird how that worked, but anyway. And you know, we had students that ended up serving. You know, they joined up because of Al Qaeda, or because of the attack. You know, everybody said there'd be another one. You know, pretty soon. You know, it was not good. And a lot of people thought somehow Saddam was involved. He wasn't, but we all thought that.